The Second Street Dreams audio network presents Classical Music in Color. I'm Judelin Lilly. Welcome to the podcast for BIPOC classical musicians and their friends. Stay tuned for the stories, the struggles, and the triumphs of musicians just like you. And most importantly, hear the music now being heard with ears that would not hear before. You might even hear some of your friends and colleagues on the show. So stay tuned. This is Classical Music in Color. Let me introduce you to composer and more, George Lewis, and musician and more, Harold Kasidu. It's about their book, Composing While Black.
I'm George Lewis, one of the co-editors of the book Composing While Black, Afrodiasporic New Music Today, or Afrodiasporische Neue Musik heute. I'm a professor of American music at Columbia University and composer, musicologist, and a few other things.
My name is Harold Kasidu. I'm also co-editor of the volume Composing While Black, Afrodiasporische Neue Musik heute, or Afrodiasporic New Music Today. And I'm a lecturer at the University of Applied Science in Osnabrück.
I spoke to them via Zoom about Composing While Black, a book of 9 essays written by Black composers from all over the world. George Lewis was in New York. Harold Kasidu was in Hamburg, Germany. Why did you decide to put this series of essays together? Mr. Lewis.
I was in residence in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg, which is an institute for advanced study there, for a year. So in any event, I was asked to curate a concert of Afrodiasporic composers of today, because we felt that a lot of the earlier generation, not to say they received much attention. I mean, Ollie Wilson, for example, was programmed for the first time at the Darmstadt Summer Course just this past summer.
Darmstadt School in Germany refers to a group of composers associated with the Darmstadt International Summer Courses for New Music.
I wrote in an article on curation that in 50 years of Darmstadt, there have been 3 Black composers before I got there. So, I mean, the number is very low. And so what can we do about that? People didn't know about the music. And another thing about it was that people tended to conflate Black composer with Black American composer, whereas our curated series with the Ensemble Moderne, we had people from the UK, we had people from Cuba, we had people from South Africa, we had Americans who've been living for a long time in Germany and Austria. So it was very diverse. And so I feel that approach, which is necessary, a worldwide globalized approach, influenced the selection of articles. Is as diverse as we could make it to show the complexity of contemporary Black diaspora music.
From the European side, do you find that attitude is changing when it comes to Black composers?
Slowly, yes, slowly. The Darmstadt Summer Course that George just mentioned is a good example. It's truly international. So in August, Anthony Braxton was there, George Lewis was there, there was music, Tashan Sori was there, Elaine Mitchener, Alvin Singleton, and it was not just an opportunity to hear their music, but there was a forum for Afrodiasporic composers to talk about their work, to theorize their work, to talk about methods, concepts, practices, which I think is really important. And there was a larger context, also a larger historical context for the music. So, this is like a good example of real sustainable change that was made. But there's also reluctance. I want to call it reluctance in terms of diversifying concert programs, in terms of, diversifying curricula and things like that.
Tell me a little bit about the authors of these essays.
Maybe one thing that would be important for me to emphasize is that there's a diversity in terms of the authors of these respective chapters, in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of the disciplines. So not all of them are musicologists. Some are music theorists, some are composers. So there's a diversity in terms of perspectives, and I think that's something that was very important for us in order to have a truly diasporic perspective.
Well, for example, Alejandro Madrid is one of the major figures in writing about Latin American music, experimental music. And so we took this chapter from his book, Tanya León's Stride. Tanya León, she's one of the most important composers of today. She was recently feted by President Biden, and she got an award. Jesse Cox is Swiss. He's a Swiss composer, Swiss Black composer, drummer, and critical theorist. Yvette Janine Jackson. Is an electronic artist. She works with electronic and computer music. Jane Forner is a musicologist. She's studied at Cambridge and also at Columbia, and she's currently at Toronto as a postdoc. Hannah Kendall is probably one of the most important young composers of the day. She's from London. And Elaine Michener, who just got feted she got one of these MBEs. She's like Elaine Michener MBE. That's like the British honor. She's like a movement artist.
The music you heard was When You're a Star, composed by Jesse Cox. Hello Tomorrow from Yvette Janine Jackson, and Invocations, composed and performed by Elaine Michener and George Lewis.
There's an extraordinary diversity of people coming to grips on this topic in their own ways.
There are two things that struck me when I was reading just the information about the book. One of the sayings, because we are black, we are making black music, and the other is out of their place, out of their depth, out of their minds.
Actually, the first quote, that was something that one of the members of the Society of Black Composers expressed. So the Society of Black Composers, they were established in 1968 in New York. They existed until 1973. This probably goes back to what George talked about earlier, the rejection of an idea of a monolithic notion of Black music. There were lots of discussions in terms of how Black music is supposed to sound like, or Black classical music. By saying we're making Black music because we are Black. That was, it took it beyond this idea that there's an essentialist notion of Black music. There are certain sonic signifiers that qualifies music as Black or so. So they sort of deconstructed that. And in terms of the three tropes, out of place, out of your mind, out of your depth, and maybe George, you can talk more about that.
Yeah, we kind of made that up.
Okay.
But we made it up on the basis of looking at, like you said, Miss Gibson, a lot of commentary over the decades about people like William Grant Still or Hale Smith or Florence Price or anybody, that earlier generation. It's people, the commentary was always, well, what are these people doing here? Sort of like, that's the idea of composing while Black, you're out of place, or driving while Black. And of course, the whole thing about being in your place has a long history in the South and in the North. You stay in your place, you got to know your place. So that's all pretty clear. And then the idea of being out of your depth, there was always some sense that they weren't quite as good technically. There was some real or imagined mistake they had made, or they couldn't do this or that or whatever. And these people had been to some of the finest institutions in the world, so it didn't make any sense. And then the last one was out of our minds. It just sounded like, well, what do you even hear the idea that you even think that you're going to be part of this scene? You must be crazy. You know? So we've developed that on our own in reading the field. This Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung thing, that was all about that. What are these people doing here? You know, so you know, you don't have to look very far to find these three tropes. So we just summarize the intent.
Tyshawn Sorey was the Artiste Étoile, which is something like the artist in residence at the Lucerne Festival last year.
The Lucerne Festival in Switzerland is considered one of the leading international classical music festivals in the world.
I read a review in one of the major German newspapers called Die Welt, where he was basically referred to as someone who was unknown. So in other words, he was out of place.
They didn't know about him. They didn't know about getting a MacArthur Fellowship, Genius Fellowship, or any of those kinds of things. And even if they did, there is a kind of a trope which says, well, we have to frame these people as being not known and somehow. For example, I made a piece about Blind Tom, which was premiered in Vienna last June. And Blind Tom, these enslaved pianists who played at the White House when he was 10 and composed his most famous piece when he was 13. Blind Tom was a world famous guy. He was probably the most famous Black composer, you know, of the 19th century, you know. And he played concerts all over the world. So I'm listening to the Bavarian Bayerische Rundfunk radio show, and they're saying, well, you know, Blind Tom, he's very legendary in the U.S., but, you know, by uns, you know, we don't know who he is. And I said, well, so I gave this talk. I quoted this talk in my pre-concert talk about the thing, and I said, well, look, you guys forgot, but in fact, Blind Tom played in Vienna, he played in London, he played all over the place. So the whole thing is that he's not at all out of place. So we're sort of recovering a lot of these early histories and using them to ground after this work today.
And one more thing, the film Chevalier, about the African-French composer who wowed Paris in the 18th century with his skill on the violin and the sword. Chevalier's music was banned in France basically forever until recently. George Lewis calls the film the first movie he's ever seen that talks about race in classical music and anti-blackness. Both he and Kasidu know that many of you listening right now have never heard of some of the essayists in composing while Black, and they want to fix that.
The main thing was just to make people aware of what's out there and some of the histories of it, and how this is not some exotic plant on stony ground, but it's something that comes out of the well springs of new music more generally.
The book is in English and in German. Co-editors George Lewis and Harold Kasidu say if you're going to buy the book, and they hope you do, please order it from their publisher. There's a link to all on the Classical Music in Color page on secondstreetdreams.com. As we come to the end of the program, I'm directing you to my website, secondstreetdreams.com. There are links to a competition you may want to enter. The 2025 Clyburn competition applications are open. And if you never got a chance to see Terence Blanchard's opera Champion, here's an opportunity to do so. It's now streaming on Met Opera On Demand. Thank you for listening to Classical Music in Color for the week of December 3rd, 2023. We're the Second Street Dreams audio network, emerging beyond the white curtain. I'm Jude Lynn Lilly.